Send her away, for she is crying after us. Send her away. How many times have we read the story in today's gospel, studied it, prayed it, and preached it maybe? And yet somehow for myself, the starkness of this plea of the disciples to Jesus has not struck me with the same impact as when I was preparing for today's preaching. These words, send her away, have echoed through my consciousness during the week. They won't leave me, and I think the reason is because I hear in them the cry that is coming from so many people in Australia, politicians and people from all walks of life, crying out at present, send her away, send them away. They are Canaanites, like this outsider woman. They are illegals. They are people smuggled. They are queue jumpers. All this hidden in the cry, send them away, out of sight, out of mind, so that we don't have to be challenged by their arrival on our shores, that we don't have to change our way of life. Send them to Malaysia, process them offshore, send them away. They're crying after us. And so this is the lens that I would like to use with you today as we explore together this gospel story as it's told in Matthew. And actually you have a copy of the gospel, I think, because I'll be working very closely with the text as we explore it together. The plight of refugees arriving by boat on your shore or on our shore here may not be addressing us so starkly at present as it is in Australia, but I want to use that as a lens into our gospel, a lens that invites us all to ponder, to explore in our minds and hearts during the week ahead, who is it in our personal, our family, our social lives, who is it that we're saying, silently maybe, or speaking it out, send her away, send them away because they're crying after us? Who is it that is crying after us in our lives today? Who is this woman whom the disciples want to send away? She's a woman who meets Jesus on the border between inside Israel and outside. She's a border or a boundary walker. She's a danger to those who are settled on either side of the border. She's like millions of people in our world today, displaced people who are also worrying and displacing the settled. They breach borders, the borders we have constructed to say who is in and who is out. The gospel storytelling community, Matthew's community, made this woman other by giving her a name that wasn't hers. They called her Canaanite, which was the name of the ancient enemies of Israel. There are no Canaanites in the time of Jesus, so why call her by this name? It makes her outsider, not one of them, just as naming asylum seekers as illegal immigrants makes them not one of us. And so the gospel story this morning keeps inviting us into the story. Who is insider and who is outsider in our lives? How do we name them? How do we call them so that they are not us, so that we keep them outside? Who do we encounter on the border, that dangerous crossover place, who cry out to us, have mercy, have mercy. And for this woman, my daughter is tormented with a demon. And that cry of hers, "My daughter is tormented with a demon," sends me back to Australia, to the asylum seekers, and I hear the cry of the many mothers. My children are traumatised by all they have been through. They're traumatised by being imprisoned when we hoped for freedom and welcome. They are refusing to eat. They are cutting themselves. They are violent. They are silent. My children are tormented with the demon of incarceration, they cry, just as the Canaanite woman cried. The cry of the other, the cry of the outsider, "Have mercy, have mercy." How could such a cry not be heard? And I think the thing that shocks us then in today's gospel, shocks us into thinking anew, is that the text says, in the face of the cry of this woman, Jesus did not answer her a word. Jesus ignores the plea of mercy. And as readers, we are shocked. Never before in the gospel story has Jesus ignored a plea. What a shocking confrontation. And it invites us again into response, into asking ourselves who it is who cries out for mercy to us and what is our response. Is our response not to answer a word? Do we remain silent in the face of the cry? Do we ignore? Or are we like the disciples? Send her away, send her away. And this confronting gospel story does not stop there. When Jesus does begin to speak to the woman, he does so in words which place himself and his people at the centre, and so further marginalises this vulnerable woman. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. My theology says that Israel has a monopoly on my mercy, not the outsider. So the Jesus who was on the border has moved back to the centre in his theologising. It's like Australians, that conglomerate of historical border crossers who have a monopoly on that country, not the newcomers, not the new outsiders. But Justa, the name that is given to this Canaanite woman in later tradition in the 3rd century, she is not silenced by Jesus' theologising or by the theologising of the Matthean community. This just woman, this woman who knows from the depth of her need and the need of her daughter what is right and what is just in Israel, on its borders, on any border, she again voices her plea, "Help me." And the gospel reader, us, we're shocked further. Surely Jesus will now help her. Surely Jesus will hear her plea. But no, Jesus answers, "It's not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Whether a proverbial statement or not, these words echo through our consciousness like the words of the disciples, "Send her away." But they are more shocking. They name-call this woman. They associate the border crosser, the marginal person crying out in need for her demon-possessed daughter, associate her with the dogs. It's like saying Australian resources for Australians, not for those yapping at our borders. Justa, however, is not silenced. Just as the asylum-seeking mothers will not be silenced, their need is too great. They quickly learn the language of the other, the language of Israel for Justa, the language of Australia for the asylum seekers. Ah, yes, but even the dogs eat the crumbs. She turns the insult to her advantage. I was struck in the early part of the liturgy today of a phrase that talked about the vulnerability of Jesus, that Jesus was vulnerable. And I have a sense that this story tells us something of the vulnerability of Jesus. Because as the story comes to an end, the Jesus who has been challenged by this woman who stands and will not go away, there's a sense of this Jesus coming to a recognition at this point in the story. He has ignored Justa, excluded her with theological and proverbial claims, but she would not be silenced. Her need and the need of her daughter was too great. And it was this need which she persistently placed before Jesus, which broke through. It broke through that traditional theology that Jesus was presented in verse 24. It broke through to Jesus, and suddenly he realized, as his words demonstrate, that in fact this woman had called him to something new. Woman, great is your faith, which has challenged mine. Let it be done for you and your daughter as you have willed, as you have wished. Jesus doesn't say as I willed or as I wished, but as you wished. And in the whole context of the gospel, he makes the wish, the desire of this woman equal to that of God as we follow the language of Matthew. She has shown Jesus what God wills, what God desires, that all should share in God's healing love. The story tells of Jesus setting aside the word or the way of God for a tradition of exclusion, and yet Justa calls Jesus back to an understanding of the centrality of God's healing word for all. Jesus was vulnerable. Jesus was vulnerable to the cry of the woman that he, in fact, had earlier rejected. Can the asylum-seeking mothers do similar for Australia, bringing us to such a moment of recognition of our shared humanity? Will we remember that we have all been, but for our Indigenous people, we have all come by boats, very recently, to the land we now call home? How many of our ancestors cried out for mercy for themselves and their children? And again, returning to the immediacy of our lives, who is it that cries out in our lives? Can we stand with the disciples and with Jesus in today's gospel and discern those places in our lives where we silently ignore, where we cry out to send them away, where we theologize, or we use very pungent proverbial statements in order to authorize our failure to respond to the cry for mercy? We can do this if we stand with the vulnerable Jesus of today's gospel, if we stand on the border or on the margins of our social world. As Jesus is presented in the gospel, we too can theologize away the call for mercy. But if we keep listening to and engaging in those who persist in their cry, then in fact we too can shift, as Jesus did, to a recognition of what is of God, that healing and wholeness belong to all. May the words of today's gospel keep echoing in our minds and hearts and find expression in our lives during the week ahead.